Welcome, everyone. I want to begin by acknowledging that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we strive to honor this relationship. Before we get to introductions, I want to go over some Zoom logistics. We are using the webinar format, so you will notice that your microphones are muted and your videos are not visible. Instead, we invite you to submit brief questions via the Q&A box, which you should be able to access at the bottom of your screen. The presentation will last approximately 40 to 45 minutes, and we will dedicate the last portion of the session to Q&A. But feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box during the presentation, and we will try to get to everything, but we have a large group today, so we may not get to everything. I'm Laura Muir, Associate Director of Academic and Public Programs and the Lewis Miller Thayer Research Curator at the Harvard Art Museums. And I have the pleasure of working with faculty from across the university who are interested in teaching with objects from the collection. And I'm joined in this work and for today's program by my colleague Jen Thum, who is the Assistant Director of Academic Engagement and Assistant Research Curator at the museums. And we were both delighted that Professors Ann Blair and Leah Whittington agreed to participate in this virtual conversation. Ann Blair is Carl H. Pforzheimer University Professor and Chair of the Department of History. She specializes in the cultural and intellectual history of early modern Europe with an emphasis on France. Her interests include the history of the book and of reading, as well as note-taking as taught in humanist schools and practices of composing and using reference works and finding devices. Leah Whittington is Professor of English. Her research centers on early modern English literature, the survival and reception of classical antiquity, England's interactions with the continental Renaissance, and the poetry of John Milton. And she has a particular interest in the role of supplements and continuations or texts that announce themselves as adding to, carrying forward, or finishing other texts. And Professors Blair and Whittington are the team behind the popular undergraduate course, Texts in Transition, in the Harvard College Program in General Education. And you will hear more from them about that soon. We devised today's program as a way to showcase some of the ways that the museums, both its staff and our objects, can figure in interdisciplinary teaching. This work is core to our mission as a teaching museum and is happening all the time, but is often invisible to our public audiences. So today we'll take a close look at our collaboration with Texts in Transition, which began last year with an installation in this space, our University Study Gallery, which is on the 3rd floor of the museum. The study gallery is open to the public, and during the academic year, it's installed with objects selected by faculty from across the university in connection with their teaching. And it usually accommodates between 9 and 12 courses each semester. And in addition to reflecting the broad expanse of teaching that takes place at Harvard, from the business school to the medical school, general education courses, freshman seminars, humanities, the sciences, and so on, it is the one place in the museums where you can get a cross-section of all of our collections, spanning time periods, cultures, and materials. And that is one of the things that we hope to achieve in the selection for Texts in Transition. And you see in this slide here, the 2 bays that we installed with objects selected by Professors Blair and Whittington. And it includes texts in various forms and materials. So you see clay and stone, metal, glass, and paper. And a side benefit of the study gallery is that in addition to the course selection, courses can also use objects selected by other faculty. So in this view of the larger gallery, you can actually see, in addition to the installation for the course at the end of the gallery, there were also there was a print by Corita Kent with text on the far wall. There was an inscribed Dave Drake storage jar in the center of the gallery, Persian manuscripts in the foreground, and a little later you'll hear about something else that was fortuitously in the gallery. So it really creates this wonderful kind of cross-disciplinary dialogue in this space. So I'll stop there so that Jen Thum can briefly introduce some of the other spaces that were used.
In addition to the study gallery, which you see here, in 2019, the class also used the permanent collection galleries, where they looked at some of the things we had on view, such as the ancient cylinder seals. among other objects. And beyond this, there is so much material that resonated with this topic that Ann and Leah also visited the Art Study Center, which you see here with our students. This is a dedicated teaching and study space where we bring works out from storage for students to encounter and engage with up close. So that's what happened in 2019. But with the pandemic, we had this necessary shift that meant that all of the teaching was remote this semester. So we worked with Ann and Leah to develop a plan to use our collections for their course online. And as part of that, we focus especially on works that read really well in the online space. So works, for example, with lots of details that we could zoom into, and works that aren't usually on view. So taking a chance to use things that are hard to bring out of storage, for example. And Text in Transition was one of many courses that we worked with online this semester. A total of about 45 courses worked with us online this semester, actually, and those come from a range of subjects. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ann and Leah to introduce Text in Transition and discuss some of the objects that they used in detail.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Jen and to Laura for inviting us to come and talk about our course. This course, Text in Transition, is a collaborative endeavor if there ever was one. Anne and I have been working on it really since the fall of 2018, and the course ran in its second iteration, or is currently running in its second iteration right now. So the course is about how written language travels through time. And that broad subject brings us to materials that texts are written on, media, writers, authors, readers, regimes of preservation, and institutions that take as their purview the preservation of materials from the past. So the first thing to do is unpack the two words in the title. So a text is a written record of human thought or language. And we, in this course, deal with texts from stone inscriptions to the messages that you send back and forth on your iPhones. Text can be as short as a few letters of the alphabet or as long as an epic poem. And we think about texts as coming from the Latin word texo texere, which means to weave, a metaphor that always connects the written word to some kind of materiality, whether it be fabric or clay, papyrus, parchment, paper, so many kinds of paper that we talk about in this course, and even lines of computer code, which have their material expressions in electrons and data files. So the second key word in the course title is transition, and this points to the ways in which the use of texts changes over time, and in particular that we at the moment are living through a major transition in how texts are produced and consumed, namely that increasingly we are using digital formats and interfaces to interact with the written word. But part of the purpose of the course is to investigate how changes are built into the history of texts. Language is a fluid form of expression. A language can be reproduced, copied, rewritten, altered, transformed. There's a lot of fluidity and manipulatability in the way that texts travel through time and space. So in the next slide, I wanted to share with you our course description, which is just to say that one of the main features of this course is thinking about how the history of media and technology and the rise of institutions that are involved in historical preservation centers around a period that Anne and I are both professionally invested in, that is to say the early modern period in Europe from about 1400 to 1800. And that in constructing this course, we try to have a symbiosis between history and literature, examining the history of technology and information alongside literary works that thematize or that reflect on questions of durability, ephemerality, and written media. So the goals of the course, as we think about it in the next slide, are not to present a straightforward narrative of media succession, as in this wonderful cartoon from the New York Times, but to try to think about how the media ecology of past cultures can illuminate the present media ecology that we live and work in now. And to really empower students to think about how texts are the product of multiple cultural factors, from individuals to technologies to institutions, and that all of those contexts together impact whether a certain piece of writing will survive over long periods of time. And we're hoping that when students come out of this course, they will be prepared to make thoughtful decisions about in the future about conservation and preservation of the written word, about sustainable use of writing. Also, always understanding that texts will vanish and disappear, be destroyed, like all other products of human imagination and creativity.
So the course is organized in 3 units where we've proceed roughly chronologically, but also try to highlight what we see as the 3 main ingredients to the preservation of texts. First is materiality, because obviously some texts have lasted a long time on very durable materials, like stone, for example, that are still visible today in their close to original form. But not all text being durable physically is not sufficient, because, for example, Maya petroglyphs we have physically, but it's very difficult to interpret them because culturally the transmission has been interrupted. So our second unit focuses on cultural transmission. What are the means by which many very fragile texts from ancient periods, not only in Europe, but also in China, had a near continuous transmission, not in physical form, but through cultural means, education, religion, that involved copying a canon of texts. So the centerpiece here is the Renaissance, as my esteemed colleague pointed out. It's where we are most expert, but it's been, of course, great fun to stretch ourselves both before and after. So in the Renaissance, we see the reception of classical texts came through from their papyrus form into the parchment manuscripts made by those early Christian monks, and then which often remained forgotten on the shelves of those monasteries for up to 1,000 years, until the humanists decided to look into those dusty corners and bring out the manuscripts, and then became very excited at what they found, copied them over, and of course at that point were able to use printing to diffuse editions and so forth, which often still play a role in scholarship today. And then in the third unit of the course, we highlight institutions. Already, as you see, I've mentioned medieval libraries, so they're there from the beginning of the course too. Few of them, though, have survived in a continuous way, except since the late Middle Ages, early modern period. And then, of course, we have a multiplication of types of institutions devoted to preservation. Libraries, but also museums and archives. And then within libraries, you get special collections and collections focusing on preservation and so on. So we hope, and at this point, of course, we end the course by looking at what is happening with these institutions under pressures from the digital revolution that we're living through right now, which is full of opportunities on the one hand, which we're really appreciating when we have had to teach virtually, all the fantastic digitizations. And I'd mentioned that every item in the Harvard Art Museums is available online for viewing digitally. You go to our collections and you start searching, and you'll have a field day, which we had in choosing a few objects we wanted to focus on. It was very difficult. So many great things there. And we could teach this course many times over with a whole different roster of things every time. So digitization is a tremendous boon on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's also very challenging. It's expensive, and it creates questions about the durability of the media that we are creating today. So what's fun about the course is that doesn't fit neatly into any sort of canonical syllabus. And we touch on the history of text on the one hand, the history of books on another, the history of technology, the history of institutions, the history of the book trade and the economics of it all. And we'd like to highlight continuities. As you can see here, we've got the British parliamentary storage of their parchment documents. Until recently, they made some major documents had to be in parchment form, and the server farms, which are the physical instantiation of the tremendous amount of material that is now used and accessed primarily digitally. So this has been the fun of the course, is to see the continuities, even while acknowledging the discontinuities. Of course, tremendous changes, material, cultural, and institutional over time. One of the highlights is to visit various places on campus, little known corners, and to meet the people who inhabit those institutions that we rely on every day, but often without barely being aware of the work they do, which is tremendously important. So at the first iteration of the course, we actually went not only to the art museums, but also to Houghton Library, to the Weissman Preservation Center, to Widener Library, to the Harvard University Archives. And it's been a very pleasant discovery that the visits that we were very committed to and didn't want to sacrifice in going online this fall have actually been a great success and very fun to do, even though they are distanced through Zoom. So we've had all the same visits as before in a variety of formats, whereby sometimes, well, mainly people come Zoom in from wherever they are. Occasionally we've had people in the spaces on campus Zooming in with us. So for example, Houghton Library, we chose a few items to look at in depth using the very high quality digitizations that are available also freely, I would add, from the Harvard Library Catalog called Hollis. So for example, our earliest object is the lower right one. There is a Carolingian manuscript full of patristic texts. And we talk about how it didn't have a high level of finish. And you could see different layers of handwriting added on over at different periods, probably by different people. Then further to the left is what comes to mind more classically when we think of a medieval manuscript. It's highly finished, illuminated. And that's also a beautiful piece, which is not fully digitized on Hollis, but which gives you a number of important pages, enough to give the students a strong sense of all the work that went into creating one of those pages, the scoring of the lines, the creating of the margins, the setting aside of space for the rubricators and the illuminators to come after the scribe to add the color to the manuscript. And the way the manuscript signals what page you're on, even without page numbers, with the heading at the top of the page. And then we looked at a polyglot Bible, which is a feat of printing. The first polyglot Bible was printed already in the 1520s, but this one was from the late 16th century, the 1580s, the Plantin Bible. And you can see here a page of is this the Old Testament?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it is, with Hebrew, with the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Hebrew, with the Vulgate of St. Jerome, and with the Latin translation of the Septuagint, which differs slightly. And in the bottom, we get the Aramaic with a Latin translation of the Aramaic. So that's a taste of some of the texts we focused on in the course. We visited the Weissman Preservation Center, and in Zoom format, these photos date from our visit in person with the students last year. In Zoom format, though, the members of the team were there in their masks, in their workspace, in order to work with not only the objects that are there, but also the instruments that are there, the microscopes, the various tools that they use, this very fine paper from which they can repair tears and so forth. And we had special fun in that visit last year when the students were each given a piece of parchment and the means to illuminate it and decorate it. And we all got to take that home with us after it had a chance to dry. We also visited this year, and we have yet to visit this semester. It will be next week. The final visit of the course is to the Harvard University Archives, which of course is full of wonderful, mostly manuscript, but not exclusively, materials collected in the course of Harvard's business, Harvard archiving its own processes, but also through acquisitions and donations, manuscripts. We looked at a student manuscript taken in the late 17th century by a Harvard undergraduate as assigned, copying out the tutor's copy of a textbook based on Aristotelian physics. But the highlight of our visit.
So really when we were conceptualizing the course, we absolutely knew that we wanted to collaborate with the Harvard Art Museums and have the students really get firsthand contact with the material objects and the sort of vehicles for texts as they travel through time. But we, at the beginning, were sort of awash in the possibilities and had to do a lot of work to think through what we wanted the students to get out of the visit to the art museum, both in terms of learning about the history of media and also learning about the history and present practices of conservation and exhibition of objects from the past. So we started with an object list that was quite overwhelming, and then started to realize that as we constructed the course, the place to land the visit to the art museums that would work most well was to use the visit to help us in our very first week explore the media ecology of the ancient Mediterranean. So in the very first week of the course, we introduced students to the origins of writing as a technology for recording human thought, and then present the students with a variety of readings from Greco-Roman writers about texts, media, and their longevity, which produce a kind of repository for thinking about the way that people have conceived longevity, posterity, and the survival of human thought over long periods of time. So when we started thinking about this visit, we wanted to start with some of the oldest things in the museum. That is to say, the collection in the Near Eastern galleries, which display various kinds of artifacts which have writing on them, including the cylinder seals that you see here, which were used as signatures, but also other objects that were not text specific, but that carry text. So one of my favorite objects in this gallery is a monumental nail, a nail that serves no functional purpose other than to memorialize the last stone that was hammered in to build a building, and it has an inscription on it describing the ruler who was responsible for the building. So we visited the galleries. This year, of course, we couldn't visit the galleries, so we had the brilliant Jen Thum come into our Zoom room to talk specifically about this ancient Egyptian figurine, which is a magical object, and its combination of figure and text is part of the way that the magic works. So we're trying to introduce students to the different kinds of relationships in the ancient Mediterranean between objects and the kinds of texts that they are vehicles for carrying. So what we are going to do now is take a look at 4 objects from the museum's collections that have become sort of keystones of the course in various different ways, and talk about them in depth and give you a chance to really sink into the individual objects and what they can tell us about their past, where they've come from. So I'm going to start with the first of the 4 objects, which is a clay tablet from ancient Mesopotamia, which dates to about the 2nd millennium BCE. You can see that the clay tablet has 2 elements. It has the tablet itself, and then an envelope that was used to wrap the tablet and keep it private. So ancient Mesopotamia is, of course, the place where writing came into being around 3500 BC, and the type of script used in clay tablets is cuneiform, written on with a stylus and making wedge-shaped marks that were used in up to 15 languages in the Akkadian and Assyrian families. Over time, the Assyrian Empire expanded from its center origin point in central Iraq into areas to the west, such as Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. And quite extensive trade routes were set up, which is the map that you're seeing here, where merchants from Assyria, Assur, down at the bottom right of the page, would travel sometimes over very long distances on donkeys and camels to set up trading posts or trading establishments in the interior of Anatolia, where they could trade tin and textiles in exchange for silver and gold. So there developed a very dense network of trading colonies that were populated simultaneously by indigenous Anatolians and by foreign Assyrian merchants. One of those colonies was called Kanesh, and you can see here in the archaeological ruins that there's a kind of mound, which is the main city. And then there's a more rectangular shaped sector, which is essentially the business district. This is where the foreign merchants would come and trade goods. Each of these little buildings that you see here is a house where an Assyrian merchant set up both domestic and business aspects of life. And what archaeologists have discovered is that many of these houses contain separate archive rooms for storing documents and accounts that are related to the trading that was happening in the region. So how did this impact archaeology? 23,000 of these clay tablets were destroyed, or sorry, were saved when the city was destroyed by fire in the 19th century BCE. And you can see in this particular example, there are some residual scorch marks on the outside of the envelope. The envelope itself is broken, but the result of the fire is that the clay tablet has been, in fact, preserved much better than it would have been otherwise. Clay tablets were usually let out to dry in the sun or in kilns, but in order to survive thousands of years like this one did, they had to be baked at much higher temperatures, which was provided by the fire. So these records explain to us a lot about the very complex social and economic community of this town of Kanesh. This letter, here's the tablet itself on the inside of the envelope. This letter is from a merchant named Assur-lamasi, who is writing to a business associate of his to confirm that they have transacted a certain amount of gold in exchange for a certain amount of tin. It's written in Akkadian. And what is in some ways most fascinating is the way that the tablet itself is hidden inside the envelope. So in the next slide, you can see the envelope and how it's broken out at the top, but the envelope does not have text on it, with the exception of an address, the addressee's name is on the front of the envelope. And what are the rest of the impressions on the envelope? Well, they come from the cylinder seal of Asr Lamasi, the merchant who's sending the letter. I found an example of a cylinder seal that's not identical to the one that was made impressions on the wax tablet, but is very similar, so that you can see the seated figure that is impressed by the seal as it rolls over the wet clay. And the archaeologists have discovered that this seal was imprinted no less than 8 times on the envelope, so that we are sure that we know who it comes from. And gives you a sense of the complexity with which these communities viewed their documents. So this was a document that needed to be saved in an archive, in a private archive, and also needed to be protected with the covering of the envelope. So with this story, with this particular object, we launched the course by telling a story not only about the role of texts in ancient Anatolia and ancient Assyria, but about the comparative longevity of different ancient media. And the way that texts get preserved over time by a combination of intention and accident. So the intention was to store the tablet in someone's private archives. The accident was that there was a fire that enabled this private document to be preserved for over 3,000 years. So this slide shows an example of, let's say, a much more recent use of a clay tablet as a medium for textual transmission, an astronomical tablet from the Seleucid Empire in 61-62 CE. So we have the idea of very long duration of media use. Clay tablets were in use essentially for 3,000 years. And proved to be very durable and useful as a medium for conveying thought and records. And to give you a kind of taste of the way that ancient writers thought about the comparative durability of media, this is a passage that we explore with the students from the 3rd century life of Adam and Eve, which tells of their adventures long after the biblical story of Genesis is over, is a kind of piece of extension and continuation of the biblical text, which says, 6 days after Adam died, Eve, realizing that her own death was near, called all her sons and daughters together. Okay, what's she going to tell them? She says, listen to me. The Lord will bring on your race the anger of his judgment, first by water, and the second time by fire. But she's got a strategy. Listen to me, my children. Make 2 kinds of tablets, some of stone and others of clay, and record on them everything that has happened in my life and your father's, what you've heard from us and what you've seen. If the Lord judges our race by water, clay tablets will become mud, but the stones ones will be preserved. If he judges our race by fire, then the stone tablets will be shattered, but the clay ones baked hard. So in the ancient world, writers are thinking about the comparative durability of media and why you might choose to preserve texts or to write texts in different media based on how long you might want them to survive.
So the second object that at the museum that really inspired the middle part of the course is this beautiful copper engraving of Desiderius Erasmus, known in his time and since as the Prince of the Humanists by Albrecht Dürer. So it really embodies many features of the changed textual culture in the early 16th century, when printing has been around for over 50 years and is well perfected as a business model and as a technology. And we not only have typography, but we also have copper engraving printing, which is the technology used in this case. Here, a depiction from 100 years later of all the different people and tools that will be used in a print shop that makes copper engravings, where the printing device is different from typography because it needs to apply extra pressure since the copper engraving engraves into the copper surface, places the ink in the grooves, and therefore the paper needs to be impressed enough to suck the paper out of the grooves suck the ink out of the grooves into the paper. But what really, there's so many facets to this portrait. We see Erasmus very self-consciously posed with his objects, the objects of his trade. He was a prolific author who published more than 220 works, new works in his lifetime, not counting the many re-editions and republications, some authorized and some not, which were also printed during his lifetime. He was a master of the printing press, of careful maneuvering with his printer to achieve the effects he wanted, to gain reputation on the one hand, to combat his enemies, who were both on the one hand conservative Catholics and on the other hand the Lutherans, since Erasmus tried to steer a middle course through the very stormy disputations and violence of the Reformation, early Reformation period. But here is the author at work, obviously serene and above any mere controversy of that might surround the daily life. And we can see many objects of his work, the inkwell and the reed pen. He's writing on a sheet of paper. He's got a folded letter to his left on his little desk. He's got this special sloped writing surface. And then around him, he has open books. We were musing about what we can tell about these books, and the answer is not much. They could be manuscript, they could be printed, as I think the open one looks to me to be. You can see the lovely bookmark in one of the upright volumes, and you can see that the volumes are often held by clasps, and that would signal likely that they were written on parchment, which is a substance we haven't talked about in this brief presentation, but we do go into in the course, which being animal skin warps and over time. So you want to keep it, the volume clasped shut to keep the pages as flat as possible. But the other depiction of writing, of course, is in the background, which is a kind of writing that especially appealed to the humanists, which is the inscription, the ancient inscription. Here's an example from the Harvard Art Museum. The humanists adopt a new script which mimics ancient inscriptions and chooses the Carolingian minuscule as the complement to these capital letters for their lowercase letters. This, of course, becomes humanist fonts like the Roman, Times New Roman, and so on, even though Gothic script was also current in Germanic and English languages in the vernacular, down to really, well, through the early modern period. So here is a brief look at what a print shop was involved. Also, just like the copper engraving shop, many people are at work in this environment, whereas prior to printing, most manuscripts were produced by one scribe, followed by a rubricator and or an illuminator, but it is basically a one person working on it at a time. Whereas suddenly, the print shop involves a lot of people, and all these people are intermediaries between the author, like Erasmus, and the finished product marketed by the printer. So we can see the person setting type from cases with lowercase below and uppercase above. So the compositor is choosing each little metal type, putting it in a stick, which then he lines up onto a bed where the full page will be laid out. We don't really see it depicted here, but it is what's being inked by the man in B with his two leather balls covered with ink. He is applying the ink to the printer, the type on the bed, that's then moved over to C, where the paper is applied with pressure from pulling the bar. Once you have a first page, you have a proofreader in D read it over and possibly make adjustments from the compositor back to correct a mistake, for example, before you pull the bar many times, say 1,000 times a day, to print 1,000 sheets right then and there, which are stacked up in E. And of course, at the end of the day, you've got someone who takes apart all the letters that you used that day, puts them back in F, back into the cases, so they can be used tomorrow to print the verso, the backside of the page that you printed today. So we can see how there are many different, there's a high investment and cost involved, all these people, the labor the metal fonts that need to be made, the paper, which is also a major expense. It's basically made from rag pulp. And all these are invested upfront in typography before you ever are able to sell a book. So Gutenberg's invention is printing by metal movable type. Gutenberg's Bible, as you can see, of course, in Harvard's example and at other institutions, many of them fully digitized, reproduced the look of a medieval manuscript Bible. But then, as I described, Erasmus, among many others, was keen on using the humanist fonts. And in any case, whether it's looking like a medieval manuscript or breaking away from that look to be a humanist imprint, it's a commercial enterprise, which is designed, makes a mass-produced object and then needs to find buyers for them so the printer can recover his expenses. But we're moving on to the third object now to really muse on what printing means. If printing simply means applying ink to a piece of paper in a repetitive way, then there is another technology called printing, which is quite different in what it facilitates and in the investment required for it, and that is xylography or woodblock printing, which is in use in East Asia long before Gutenberg, although there seems to be no solid evidence for the idea that printing was transmitted from Asia to Europe, unlike, for example, paper, which clearly was, or say the compass. So it's likely that movable type was just a new invention in the West, even though in East Asia, they also had movable type well before Gutenberg. Movable type in East Asia can be metal, but it's often also wood or ceramic, but it was used much less frequently than xylography. Xylography presents a huge set of advantages, and here's a lovely woodblock from the Harvard Museum's collection from the 18th, 19th century, which is from Korea in Chinese characters. And we can see here the front of a block and the back of the same block. So it's double-sided. You want to save your wood and maximize it. Each one of these sides will generate one printed sheet, which is actually going to be printed only single-sided, unlike in the European case. And thanks to a Chinese visitor who came and participated in book history activities at Harvard, we can show you some quick videos of how traditional Chinese xylography is being used still today in Buddhist temples to produce traditional books, even when most books in China are not produced this way. But we can get a sense of just how easy it is to print from a woodblock. There isn't the whole cumbersome metal press, very heavy equipment. So I will play this video. So the person here has a woodblock in front of her. He's inking it, just like the Europeans do, with that sort of ball covered with ink. He applies her rice paper to it, presses it once, and now the paper is printed. Next step is to fold each of these single-sided papers to create what functions like a double-sided sheet, just like our sheet. But you can see that it's only printed on one side and then folded. And the final step then is to stack them together in order, to sew them. This is the traditional Chinese binding with these sort of blue paper covers, which then could be put together in boxes and sold as a set. Frequently, Chinese books don't have a whole lot in one bound volume, so the book itself would involve 5 or 6 fascicles, all of them in a box. All right. So one of the tremendous advantages of xylography, it costs a lot less upfront, and once you have a woodblock, you can save it. As long as the woodblock is in good shape, you can print from it at any time. So here we have a massive collection from Korea, in fact, dating back to the 13th century, of more than 81,000 woodblocks containing the Buddhist canon. And you can see that it's just a print-on-demand system, well before what we're so proud of today, to have print-on-demand thanks to digital technologies. So this was prompted by the wonderful serendipity of Leah and I wandering around the gallery and noticing the the display items on display for a different course that was being taught also in fall 2019, Korean literature and translation, which gave us an idea to integrate into our course. So that's some of the cross-fertilization that can happen thanks to the museum as a space.
The last object that we want to share with you ever so briefly is this object, which is called a squeeze. A squeeze is an impression made with a kind of paper-like substance that takes the exact surface of a stone inscription or a clay inscription. Squeezes were one of the earliest methods for recording archaeological inscriptions, especially in Egypt, starting in the 1840s. First, they were used as records because it was so much easier to transport the piece of paper than it was to carry the stone. And they reflected more of the object's surface than a traditional rubbing would. Then they became souvenirs of the kind that you would purchase if you went on a tour of Egyptian sites in the 1890s and early 20th century. And they remain an incredibly useful tool for scholars and epigraphers because they have the most accurate record of the inscribed surface of a text. Now, some fascinating points that we use this squeeze to talk about. One is, in text transmission, there's always an issue of replicability. You have an original and you want to reproduce. So different technologies for textual transmission allow reproduction at different scale. Squeezes allow for one incredibly exact reproduction, sometimes so exact that in cases where the original object is lost, the squeeze becomes a kind of substitute object, and scholars can work from it as if they were working from the stone where the inscription was inscribed. We also use this object to talk a little bit about how texts enter institutional collections very often as a result of a series of transactions. This squeeze was probably produced in Egypt for tourists. It was probably purchased in the late 19th or early 20th century by someone who had visited a site in Egypt, and then came into the collection of a Harvard person, George Wigglesworth, who decided to donate his collection of 12 squeezes to the museum to be part of the teaching and research collection that many scholars of Egypt still rely on today when they are doing their research. So replicability and provenance are some of the other main themes that bring us to questions like mirrors of internet archives and how you manage to create multiple versions of texts so that they are more likely to survive over time. Okay, we'll stop there. Those are our 4 spectacular objects from the museum collections, and we're delighted to answer questions and be in conversation with Laura and Jen in the remaining time that we have together.
Thank you so much, Anne and Leah. That was fantastic. And I think we have some great questions in the Q&A box, and I invite anyone who hasn't had a chance to submit a question to go ahead and do that. But maybe Jen will kick us off with the first question.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking us on this really exciting journey. I'm wondering if you could talk about the role that the museums played in assignments for.
Yes, we can. What our very first assignment is for the students to explore an object in the collection and learn about key aspects of it. So we have the students browse the collections, visit the galleries, and then settle on an object where they research the context, the type of object, the way that the text relates to the object, and then they create a museum label as if we're creating an exhibition for our course to introduce viewers to what's interesting about this object vis-a-vis the theme of text traveling through time. Yes, go ahead.
And then we ask the students to choose a text to work on throughout the semester. And one of their next assignments is to write a label for the object they've selected. So that's mimicking the labels that the museums have created and that we study. And therefore they're doing a little museum curation on their own.
That's fantastic. As part of the course collaboration, it was wonderful to think about some of the labels that are current, but also the past versions of labels and how those have evolved. And we shared some of those. So thinking about just another kind of evolving text within the context of the museum. So we were thrilled with that assignment.
Yes, and Laura, I wanted to add on that because so it's become actually a bigger topic recently in that we've talked about description as one of the activities that people engage in when they're having to record documents, and description and cataloging end up having huge implications for how different kinds of objects are discoverable, and how they are presented under various regimes of acculturation. So in fact, the whole idea of the frame for an object has become a sort of increasingly important as the course goes on.
One thing that comes to mind is the preservation of former catalogs. One of the great features of the online catalog is you can modify it, but then there is no record of the older online catalog because it's just a constantly morphing thing. And I'm wondering what kinds of records you keep of, you know, the catalog entries as they change over time. Obviously, the ones that are in, you know, card catalog form or published, you know, exhibition catalogs, those are sort of on paper. But the electronic is prone to change without leaving traces, really.
That's a great question. Jen, I mean, I think.
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead, Laura.
I mean, I think there are, you know, things that are saved over time. So there are vestiges of that we do keep track of. And often in the actual like current record, we do try to say like if a title was changed, the former title was this and why that was. But I think it's something to be really conscious of because it's so ephemeral in a certain sense.
Yeah, sometimes you look at an object in our database and be able to see prior labels preserved digitally. There is a record of them somehow, but they don't always show up online. And if you want to see those changes sort of on the front end, it's a good experience for students to come and look at our curatorial files where they're very often preserved.
That's true. I want to get to some of the questions that our participants have submitted. The first one is, with the decrease in physical forms of text due to electronic texts, how will current texts be preserved and survive?
That is a great question. And we don't know, do we? I mean, when printing came on, people were worried that, you know, things printed on paper wouldn't last as long as parchment manuscripts and wouldn't this be terrible? As it happens, you know, 500 years later, those early printed books have proven so far just as durable. But you really can't tell. Of course, we can think of all those media like microfilm and so forth that were going to solve all the storage problems of the world. And it turned out to be not as long-lived as one might have hoped, although microfilm, interestingly, has redeemed itself by proving to be very useful for automated digitization. So, you know, we make it up as we go along. It's very hard to know, but it's certainly one of the purposes of the course is to sensitize students to the fact that we may have a plethora of information at our fingertips, but how durable it is a completely different matter. And I love to show them, you know, I have my 3.5-inch floppy diskettes, which now I have no computer to read, but I can't part with them because they have, you know, all of my stuff. Of course, meanwhile, I hope that I have upgraded all that stuff into, you know, current formats. But right, digital formats require maintenance. And one of the fantastic commitments that Harvard libraries and museums make is to save the stuff, even through many costly upgrades of hardware and software. And it's a challenge. I mean, and it's not going to change. I don't think we've landed, you know, how would we know that we've landed on the durable format? You know, is PDF going to be here in 500 years? I don't know. Maybe it will. Someone else will find out.
Great. Another question, do you deal with the transition of texts across media, including translation and adaptation? This is someone named Dana Saji, who says, I teach a course on the movement of Arabian Nights and wondering if you have any tricks or ideas regarding the topic of movement of texts into the non-written and into performances.
That's a wonderful question, not least because we do devote a kind of full week to the ways in which texts become, let's say, the starting point for other texts, whether it be translation, imitation, adaptation, rewriting, performance. We focus on the early modern period in part because early modern writers were themselves translating and rewriting many texts from the past. But like Arabian Nights, those texts end up getting repurposed in multiple forms, some of them in different media, like performance, and others in different genres, say switching from romance to history, or from epic to lyric, right? So we spend quite a bit of time talking about the ways that writers remake old forms of texts in order to make new forms.
And that's what makes some texts very long-lived, is
Right.
that they have proven very fertile in spawning new versions of and imitations.
Okay, let's see. I'm gonna thank you so much for that. The explanation of Durer's portrait made me think of Ex Libris. Durer was the first, or one of the first, to make an Ex Libris. Is there a historical collection of early Ex Libris at Harvard?
That's a great question.
You're...
They have inscribed their ownership marks in books. You know, they were doing that already also in the Middle Ages. A printed Ex Libris, you know, glued in, of the kind that we see in a lot of Harvard books, strikes me as something that dates from not before the 18th century, probably. I don't know, but a historical collection would be fabulous, because one thing you can find online is the list of all the special collections at Harvard that were due to donations of people. And there are it's a very long list, alphabetized by the name of the person. And often they will show you the bookplate corresponding to that person's gift. So there would be, and then typically inside Hollis, you could move from one bookplate to another. So that might be a cool research project, actually. I'm not aware that it's been studied.
Yeah, I love that. We have a question about if you have noticed if there's a particular object or type of object which seems to be especially interesting to students.
Computers. I say that because last week, you know, one of the amazing things about this course is that we go sort of from papyrus to server farms. And last week, Anne gave just a spectacular lecture on the sort of rise of computers as a form of technology, and all of the social and political and educational context that created Silicon Valley as a center for innovation in computing. And the students were really fascinated to think about computers in relationship to counting machines from the 19th century, which, of course, that's what computers do, is they make calculations. So the history of technology has been a really interesting flashpoint for the course throughout, to be honest. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We are right at 3 o'clock, so I think we have to, I know we could go on talking, but I really want to thank you, Anne Blair and Leah Whittington, and my colleague Jen Thum for your collaboration. This has been wonderful to work with you, and I'm glad we were able to share it with a broader audience today. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you again, Anne and Leah.
Thank you both, and everyone at the museum.
Thanks.